Sharon had once been the kind of student teachers pointed to proudly sharp, ambitious, laser-focused on a future that looked almost guaranteed. She had secured a full academic scholarship to the Georgia Institute of Technology, intending to study aerospace engineering. That scholarship was more than just money. It was a doorway toward her dream job at NASA, something she had spoken about since childhood. But despite the incredible opportunity waiting for her, Sharon never arrived on campus. She was carrying something she had kept hidden from almost everyone. During her final months of high school, she became pregnant, and the baby's father, her boyfriend at the time, was never told what had happened. Sharon concealed the pregnancy so carefully that few suspected anything unusual. Eventually, she gave birth to a son and quietly agreed to let a wealthy couple from Texas adopt him. Even after the adoption, the pregnancy disrupted everything she had planned. At one point, she apparently even attempted to run away with her boyfriend, though that plan collapsed just as quickly as it began. With the scholarship abandoned and her life suddenly unfamiliar, Sharon decided she needed a completely new start. She relocated to Tampa, Florida, and there she met a man named Franklin Delano Floyd. Sharon moved in with him, though their relationship was never clearly defined. Whether they were romantically involved or something more complicated, they were undeniably tied together. However, even after moving with Frank, Sharon began seeing someone else. Not long afterward, she became pregnant again. Yet she never informed the new boyfriend that he was going to be a father. This time, though, she chose to keep her baby. She intended to raise her child, and Frank stayed in the picture. Sharon gave birth to Michael Gregory Marshall in 1988. Frank and Sharon's relationship was complicated, enough that friends couldn't label it easily. They lived together, yet their dynamic never clearly resembled a traditional romantic partnership. Still, the two of them provided for Michael as best they could. Frank earned some money working as a painter, but he suffered from chronic back problems and often struggled to maintain steady employment. That left most of the responsibility on Sharon. To support herself and Michael and Frank, she became an exotic dancer, although the wages alone weren't enough. The small family also relied heavily on welfare checks to make ends meet. Sharon's co-workers described her as gentle and warm, but she developed a particularly strong connection with an 18-year-old dancer named Cheryl Comesso. Despite their close friendship, Frank clashed with Cheryl frequently. There were also rumors that he and Cheryl might have had a brief romantic involvement, further complicating the situation. In 1989, during what should have been a simple weekend outing, Sharon, Frank, and Cheryl went boating together. But tensions boiled over, and Frank and Cheryl got into a heated argument. Shortly afterward, Cheryl reported Sharon to social services, accusing her of hiding some of the income she made dancing in order to continue receiving government assistance. The accusation caused Sharon to lose access to welfare aid entirely. Frank was furious. He confronted Cheryl outside the club where they worked and, according to witnesses, actually punched her in the face during the altercation. Soon after, Cheryl left her father's house to visit a friend, but she never checked in to confirm she'd arrived. Her father contacted police, and shortly afterward her Corvette was discovered abandoned at the airport. Cheryl had vanished. Naturally, Frank and Sharon were quickly labeled as persons of interest, but no physical evidence surfaced linking them to Cheryl's disappearance. With suspicion already following them, the pair abruptly packed up and fled the area. This only increased investigators' doubts, especially since Frank and Sharon began using different names as they traveled. In 1989, they formally married, though Frank insisted the wedding had nothing to do with romance. He claimed that marrying Sharon was just a way to give Michael a proper family name, though they continued adopting multiple aliases while traveling. Eventually, they settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Sharon again worked as an exotic dancer. People liked her easily. She made friends wherever she went. But Frank had the opposite reputation. He was described as aggressive, moody, and difficult, and nearly everyone who encountered him kept their distance. Another conflict erupted between Frank and another dancer, prompting the woman to tell Sharon she should escape from him while she still could. According to witnesses, Frank responded chillingly, saying, "If she ever left me, I'd kill her." What Frank didn't know was that Sharon was secretly planning to leave. She had met a man at the club and intended to run away with him and take Michael with her. She might have already left if she hadn't been terrified of what Frank might do. Before she could put her plan into action, tragedy struck. Sharon was discovered unconscious along a highway. Authorities believed she had been the victim of a hit-and-run accident. Frank claimed he had been asleep during the incident and couldn't provide any useful information. Sharon was rushed to the hospital, where she remained unconscious for days. Her co-workers came to visit often while she was hospitalized, and many noticed she seemed to be improving gradually. Then suddenly, Frank prevented them from seeing her altogether without offering any explanation. 5 days after the accident, Sharon died. The circumstances surrounding her death raised alarms almost immediately. Many suspected Frank had been involved, particularly because her condition seemed to improve before she inexplicably declined. The attending doctor was uneasy about the incident as well. He saw older bruises on Sharon's body and classified her death as homicide, suggesting her fatal head injury might not have been caused by a vehicle at all. No definitive evidence linked Frank directly to Sharon's death, yet almost everyone in her circle believed he was responsible. The fact that Sharon's co-workers, not Frank, paid for her headstone only intensified suspicions. Not long after, Frank began contacting life insurance companies trying to collect on a policy worth $80,000 a policy he had purchased only a few months before Sharon died. The issue was that Frank often used aliases. The social security numbers he provided didn't match any of the identities he claimed. After several failed attempts, he finally used his real name, Franklin Delano Floyd. That single disclosure would unravel nearly every lie he had spent years constructing. The Cold War had officially transformed into a contest of invisible mathematics. Washington and Moscow weren't simply racing to build bigger bombs. They were hunting for the equations that determined when they might die. Every war before this relied on visible machinery, soldiers, fleets, armored divisions, bases. But nuclear strategy wasn't about movement. It was about prediction. Whoever could calculate faster could strike first. Whoever could strike first could end humanity. The terrifying irony? The Americans trusted a foreign-born genius outsider to design those calculations, never realizing that he was quietly adjusting them to help their enemies stay equal. From the beginning, Pakamov understood something most spies never learned. The better you perform, the less anyone suspects you. Where a typical intelligence agent might sneak documents out of filing cabinets, Pakamov designed the filing cabinets. He was the architect of simulation systems that determined how many bombs must be built, where they should be placed, and how quickly a retaliatory launch must occur. He wasn't stealing secrets, he was writing them. His handwriting became part of official doctrine. His models steered generals. And every time the Pentagon made a strategic shift, they were unknowingly following guidance from a physicist who reported to Moscow every Thursday night. That was the part nobody in Washington could see. They believed espionage was something done by traitors in shadowy basements. They imagined obvious villains, not quiet theorists with chalk on their fingers. But Pakamov played a different game. He learned every American cultural rule. Dress conservatively, never argue politics, speak softly, avoid attention, never appear brilliant on purpose, never appear foreign, never appear ideological. He removed everything suspicious until he became background noise. This was his greatest calculation to eliminate the variables that made him noticeable. Washington thought nuclear advantage was measured in warheads and delivery systems. But the real battlefield was information. Missile accuracy, blast yields, launch detection time, submarine acoustics, radar interpretation, re-entry survivability, shielding tolerances. These numbers determined who could pull the trigger first. If America believed it had superiority, it might launch a first strike. If the USSR believed it had superiority, it might do the same. But if both sides believed the other was still strong, nuclear war stayed theoretical. This paradox, the balance of terror, depended on perfectly shaped data, which meant a mathematician could manipulate the fate of the world using nothing more than equations disguised as analysis. Soviet intelligence rarely trusted anyone, but Pakamov was reliable because he had no ideology. He was an emotional dot. He didn't hate capitalism. He didn't adore socialism. He believed something else. Humans were too irrational to be trusted with nuclear supremacy. By keeping both sides equal, he believed he was preventing catastrophe. He wasn't loyal to Moscow or Washington. He was loyal to equilibrium. That made him far more dangerous than a traditional spy. Most spies want a side to win. Pakamov wanted no side to win. This is a subtle detail historians still ignore. He didn't smuggle blueprints. He didn't hand off missile schematics. He didn't steal warheads. He adjusted risk analysis models, making the US believe the USSR was always close enough to prevent a first strike. Just a simple shift in probability. Soviet accuracy may improve within 24 months. Silo duplication increases survivability by 32%. Submarine quieting expected to reach US parity. These weren't facts, they were predictions shaped with intention. Washington read them as warnings. Moscow read them as reassurance. His numbers kept the world balanced on a razor-thin line. Exactly where he wanted it. In 1974, America believed it had detected catastrophic weaknesses in Soviet missile guidance. Some believed this was their window, the moment the US could theoretically eliminate Moscow's ability to retaliate. A preemptive nuclear strike scenario was quietly drafted. How close? One general estimated that decision meetings were within hours of irreversible conclusions. Then, suddenly, almost suspiciously, Washington received new analysis showing Soviet improvements in guidance accuracy and underground bunker survivability. Pakhamov had inserted those numbers into a briefing model the Pentagon trusted, and the threat vanished. The document was accepted without question. A week later, Moscow quietly updated its own understanding, effectively neutralizing America's fantasy of superiority. The world stayed frozen, terrifying, stable. America feared Soviet missiles, but that wasn't its real vulnerability. Its real weakness was belief that nuclear winning was possible. The moment the US believed it could win, it would begin planning to win. So Pakhamov fed them a diet of precise fear. The Soviets are improving faster. They are closing the gap in MIRV technology. Their submarine deployments are becoming undetectable. Every statement was small enough to be plausible, just enough uncertainty to crush ambition. He wasn't saying the Soviets are stronger. He was saying they are strong enough. That distinction changed everything. Washington had a habit. If someone quietly agreed with your assumptions, you assumed they were loyal. Pakhamov positioned himself as a careful realist. The kind of analyst generals liked, someone who always urged caution, always advised against aggressive shortcuts. Generals trusted caution. Politicians trusted caution. Technocrats trusted caution. So when Pakhamov said, it would be dangerous to assume Soviet vulnerability, everyone nodded. They thought he was protecting America from arrogance. He was actually protecting the USSR from annihilation. Most people think espionage is about extracting information. But Pakhamov's success came from injecting information. Where other spies created holes, he created illusions. Where others stole, he contributed. He added, not subtracted. His loyalty wasn't to Moscow's ideology or America's security. His loyalty was to the idea that nuclear imbalance meant extinction. And balance, even terrifying balance, was the only thing keeping the world alive. In the end, his most effective act of betrayal was also his most effective act of protection. He prevented nuclear victory. And therefore, ironically, he prevented nuclear war. By the late 1970s, Washington believed it was shaping the Cold War's future through hardware satellites, missiles, radar, anti-ballistic platforms, strategic defense initiative proposals, an entire technological superstructure designed to guarantee American advantage. Yet none of those systems mattered as much as the probabilities fed into them. The Pentagon relied on mathematical models like oracles. If you told a general there was a 17% chance the enemy could retaliate, he'd treat that number like scripture. Behind those sacred numerical predictions was a single unseen author. Twice a month, Pakhamov attended high-level nuclear readiness briefings. The kind of meetings where senior analysts debated which cities would survive and which wouldn't. The conference room always felt eerily calm-polished mahogany table. Projection screens humming, sealed doors, security clearances checked twice. And sitting silently at that table, looking like an ordinary mid-tier scientist, was the one individual whose quiet suggestions determined the fate of entire nations. He spoke rarely. When he did, generals listened. To Washington, he was a trusted voice of sober restraint. To Moscow, he was a ghost. Unlike conventional spies who risked dead drops and clandestine meetings, Pakhamov engineered passive exfiltration. Here was the brilliance. He didn't need to steal classified data. He simply embedded tiny pattern signals inside published academic papers and unclassified technical reports material that was legally mailed overseas without suspicion. These weren't the secrets, yet the tiny adjustments inside them allowed Soviet analysts to reverse engineer Washington's thinking, projected missile flight paths, American assumptions about Soviet radar, Expected strike survivability, U.S. targeting calculations. The message wasn't, "Here are American secrets." It was, "Here's what America thinks about your secrets," which was more valuable. Whenever he published a paper, even a harmless statistical analysis, Soviet code analysts examined every numerical sequence. Sometimes the placement of a footnote indicated a weapons trend. Sometimes an equation coefficient hinted at an intelligence update. One comma could mean increased deployment tempo. A mislabeled chart axis could be interpreted as U.S. assumes new targeting accuracy. Washington thought it was reading academic mathematics. Moscow treated it like encrypted doctrine. He hid secrets in plain view because open information is the least suspicious place to hide anything. By the early 80s, Pakhomov started noticing something chilling. Both sides were becoming too good at surviving. Submarines grew quieter, warning systems more aggressive, missile interception more precise. Nuclear equilibrium was evolving into something else. Nuclear optimism. Optimism was deadly. If leaders believed survival was possible, then launching a nuclear war might appear thinkable, even rational. His purpose had been balance, not encouragement. Ironically, by stabilizing both superpowers, he had helped escalate their belief that victory could be engineered. He feared he was unintentionally building the conditions for the very catastrophe he tried to avoid. Most people think the closest nuclear call happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're wrong. The real moment, the terrifying, quiet moment happened in 1983, when false radar signals convinced Moscow the US had launched ballistic missiles. For several minutes, the world hovered on a knife edge. Washington never knew. The public never felt a thing. But Pakhomov later learned how dangerously near retaliation became. His equilibrium model almost snapped. The horrifying part? He understood that if a single decision-maker believed retaliation was survivable, they might have fired on instinct. Balance was no longer enough. He needed to make annihilation inevitable, not avoidable. For the first time, he acted without ideological reasoning. Not for Moscow, not for science, not for theory. He manipulated the US strategic models to increase the probability of total mutual destruction in every projected war scenario. He ensured that in every simulation, every calculation, every strategic outcome, nuclear war ended with guaranteed extinction. This was his new objective: make war mathematically unwinnable. He skewed projected missile defense failures just enough. He raised submarine retaliation estimates. He exaggerated bunker penetration risks. Result: Pentagon analysts began accepting a horrifying conclusion: no scenario guarantees you survival. His models reshaped nuclear doctrine. Soviet handlers accused him of sabotage. They wanted strategic equality, not hopeless apocalypse. They demanded explanations. Why was he increasing destruction probability? Why was he undermining Soviet first strike hopes? He simply responded with one sentence: if either side believes survival is possible, then war becomes inevitable. Even Soviet intelligence struggled to argue against that logic. They reluctantly let him continue. History would later prove his logic correct. It was a young Pentagon prodigy named Nathaniel Carter, brilliant, relentless, hyper-analytical. Carter was suspicious of everything, especially predictions. He didn't trust inherited models. He tore calculations apart line by line. He believed numbers could be weaponized. For the first time, someone noticed patterns in Pakhomov's forecasting, a subtle bias, always pushing toward caution and mutual destruction. He quietly launched an inquiry, not an official one, a personal one. Carter wasn't hunting a traitor. He was hunting a pattern. Deep inside a classified simulation facility, Carter approached Pakhomov with a simple observation: your models always assume Soviet capability increases faster than evidence supports. Most spies would panic. Pakhomov didn't. He replied calmly. That's because underestimating danger leads to war. But overestimating danger prevents it. That answer wasn't just clever, it was strategically airtight. Carter walked away uncertain but unconvinced. Here's the chilling part. Carter eventually realized Pakhomov wasn't helping the Soviets win. He was preventing everyone from winning. So Carter stopped investigating. He didn't alert security. He didn't file a report. He allowed a foreign asset to continue influencing nuclear doctrine because deep down he understood the terrifying truth. Pakhomov might be the only person preventing global suicide. In the end, loyalty didn't matter. Nationality didn't matter. Ideology didn't matter. Only equilibrium mattered. Mutual destruction became the ultimate safety mechanism. Human survival depended on mathematical despair.
by the end of the Cold War. Pakamov occupied a bizarre place in global history, indispensable yet invisible, necessary yet unknown. Governments celebrated the easing of nuclear tensions without realizing a hidden mathematician had shaped half the logic that prevented annihilation. But peace, ironically, threatened his purpose. The dissolution of the Soviet Union shattered the geopolitical symmetry he spent his life engineering. Moscow wasn't the same adversary. Washington wasn't the same guardian. The balance he protected vanished almost overnight, and that terrified him more than any missile ever had. Most people saw the end of the Cold War as a global victory, freedom defeating totalitarianism, democracy triumphing over communism. But Pakamov didn't believe in ideological victories. He believed in balance, and suddenly balance was evaporating. He feared a triumphalist America might assume history had granted it permanent superiority, leading some future leader to attempt nuclear coercion or strategic intimidation, or worse, China, not even part of his original calculation, might exploit the vacuum. The world was losing its terrifying equilibrium and replacing it with arrogance. He retired quietly, long before normal retirement age. No scandal, no suspicion. Just a polite exit. Health reasons, Washington barely noticed. To the Pentagon, he was just another mid-level theorist, stepping aside in a softer era when nuclear war seemed impossible. But he was watching. Always watching. He monitored missile treaties with obsessive precision. He studied defense budgets like scripture. He tracked every modernization effort, every radar upgrade, every submarine contract. He wasn't done. He simply changed battlefields. By the late 1990s, modernized Russian leaders began restoring Cold War posture missile silos, advanced radar, submarine stealth redesigns. The United States responded with expanded missile defense frameworks and renewed talk of strategic superiority. Suddenly, the nightmare was returning. The belief that nuclear victory might someday be achievable. That belief was the most dangerous technology on Earth. Retired but still mathematically unstoppable. He developed a final simulation, Engine 1, that projected the entire 21st century nuclear environment based on dozens of new variables: cyber war, hypersonic delivery, space-based detection, orbital weaponization, AI targeting, autonomous retaliation. His conclusion was horrifyingly elegant. The next nuclear war wouldn't require ideology-only miscalculation. Technology itself had become unstable. Artificial trigger systems and machine-speed warfare meant nuclear retaliation could become automated, meaning humans would no longer decide anything. Algorithms were Cold War nuclear logic depended on slow decisions, phone calls, briefings, human doubt. But 21st century nuclear systems moved in milliseconds, not hours. That removed the one factor that saved the planet in 1983: human hesitation. Now, hesitation might vanish. The world wasn't drifting toward PSIT was entering a new automated age of nuclear risk. A machine might one day misread a satellite image and launch a retaliatory strike before any human could stop it. He recognized that the future wasn't bipolar, it was nonlinear. Few people know this, but during the early 2000s, he made quiet contact with scientists involved in international nuclear monitoring networks. He never admitted his past role. He never mentioned Moscow. He positioned himself as a retired mathematician interested in stability theory. He offered algorithmic feedback, proposed new verification models, suggested hard-coded human intervention requirements. Most saw him as a harmless old academic ranting about machine trigger risk. They dismissed him politely. They had no idea he had once manipulated the Cold War. Your entire Cold War script, the missiles, the spies. The superpowers rests on a terrifying calculation. Deterrence works only if both sides believe retaliation will happen quickly enough to matter. But modern systems might retaliate too quickly, so quickly there's no pause, no sanity, no human voice in the loop. Deterrence depends on fear. Automation eliminates fear, and eliminating fear makes war possible again. In other words, the very technology designed to prevent war may create it. If historians ever discovered a Soviet-born mathematician quietly influenced American nuclear doctrine for decades, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Washington would deny he mattered. Moscow would deny he existed. Even today, his archive is sealed somewhere inside intelligence databases under an entirely different identity. To expose him would force governments to admit that the balance of annihilation, the central logic that prevented nuclear war, was crafted by a single, unaffiliated outsider. No superpower wants that story told. Patriotism creates winners. Winning creates war. Equilibrium prevents war. This wasn't about allegiance, it was about mathematics. He understood a terrifying truth. The Cold War was only peaceful because everyone believed they would die. Remove that belief and history restarts. The collapse of the USSR didn't remove nuclear danger. It transformed it, and even now, decades later, Pachomov's models still echo inside war colleges, strategic briefings, and classified deterrence theory. They just don't know who wrote them. In his last unpublished manuscript, he wrote one line that may be the most chilling nuclear sentence ever conceived. Humanity survived the 20th century only because it was terrified of itself. And below it, written like a mathematical conclusion, the future depends on fear remaining human, meaning if machines ever control nuclear retaliation, deterrence collapses. Because machines can't feel terror. Machines don't hesitate. Machines don't question, machines don't panic, and therefore machines might fire. In the end, Pachomov wasn't protecting Moscow. He wasn't protecting Washington, he was protecting hesitation, the only emotion keeping the world alive.
The strangest thing about Pachomov's legacy is that it exists only in silence. No medals, no statues, no CIA file labeled enemy operative. His triumph was anonymity. His influence lived inside equations, doctrine memos. Undefined strategic recommendations and nameless amendments inside Pentagon reports. A spy who never actually stole anything left fingerprints on the entire nuclear century. But only in places nobody was supposed to look, and that's why history will never know him. The world he shaped didn't understand it was shaped. Even intelligence officials sometimes misunderstand espionage. They think danger is built through blueprints or stolen codes or intercepted cables. But Pakamov proves something more terrifying. Humanity can be manipulated not by removing secrets, but by suggesting assumptions. He didn't deliver hardware designs to Moscow. He delivered something far more valuable: American nuclear self-perception. His true weapon was a subtle shift in how Washington understood itself. If America believed it could be destroyed, then it behaved rationally. If America believed it was invincible, then it took risks. He wasn't preventing war by strengthening Moscow. He was preventing war by weakening certainty. Why his existence can never be revealed, imagine the implications. If the US admitted a foreign mathematician influenced nuclear doctrine for decades, democratic leaders would look incompetent. If Russia admitted they trusted an unmonitored civilian more than their own generals, Moscow would appear absurd. If either side acknowledged that a single thinker prevented nuclear war, then deterrence would seem fragile, personal, accidental. No government tolerates that kind of truth. So history will bury him because history prefers stories with flags and heroes, not a ghost with a chalkboard. He understood one horrifying pattern: weapons keep evolving. Humans don't. Fear doesn't scale. Technology does. The global arsenal kept expanding even while doctrines tried shrinking the risk. In other words, deterrence was always mathematically unstable. Human civilization survived only because nobody wanted to test the equations. Pakamov's genius wasn't brilliance, it was restraint disguised as analysis. He made annihilation obvious. He made victory impossible. He made fear rational. And fear, cold mathematical fear, is what saved everybody. A quiet death. There are conflicting rumors about how he spent his last years. Some say he retired in California, living near a university library, quietly reading mathematics journals until the end. Others claim he returned to Eastern Europe under a different identity and lived out his life in a modest countryside home. A few classified notes hint he may have died under another person's name entirely. What matters is not where he ended, but the world he left behind, one still trembling under equations he built. The archive nobody admits exists somewhere inside an American intelligence vault, possibly possibly NSA. There is allegedly a long-lost file labeled only with a numerical code. Inside it are handwritten pages, maybe letters, maybe early drafts of nuclear probability frameworks. No one will ever admit the file exists. But analysts who've seen fragments describe the same unsettling reaction. It felt like reading the manual of the Cold War, written by someone nobody trained, like discovering that the era wasn't shaped by nations, but by a single, unrecognized mind. The philosophy he never spoke aloud. In one notebook margin, found decades later, an anonymous analyst discovered a single strange equation that didn't seem to match any known model. Beside it was a short line of text, written in worn pencil. Victory is the trigger of extinction. No name, no explanation, just that. Perhaps that sentence explains every decision he ever made. Why no historian can tell this story? Historians study presidents, treaties, armories, budgets, military doctrine, official cables. They don't study anonymous mathematicians sitting in back rows of classified meetings, quietly nudging global logic one decimal point at a time. His contribution was invisible on purpose. Invisible so he could survive. Invisible so civilization could survive. The most uncomfortable truth: if Pakamov didn't exist, someone like him would have had to, because nuclear deterrence isn't a national strategy. It's a species-level survival mechanism. For the first time in human history, extinction required a strategy. Someone had to design that strategy. Someone did. How the world will remember him, it won't. That's the entire point. He wasn't a spy seeking glory. He wasn't a defector seeking safety. He wasn't a patriot seeking advantage. He was a mathematician seeking equilibrium. The Cold War wasn't saved by ideology or diplomacy or military virtue. It was saved by equations no politician ever read, written by a ghost who understood that the human species needed to fear itself in order to survive its own invention. The last unsolved paradox. Humanity ended the Cold War believing it had survived a geopolitical conflict. But maybe the Cold War was actually a psychological experiment testing whether a species could remain terrified long enough to stay alive. If that's true, then Pakimov didn't just spy on history, he manipulated history. He hacked the Cold War, and he won by making sure nobody ever could.